He used to give others everything, his time, his energy, his trust. Now, he keeps just one thing for himself: silence. Everyone asks him why he lives alone. No one asks what made him stop wanting to share his life with someone. They look at that quiet house and assume he's lonely. They see the lights still on at night with no one beside him, meals with just one chair, one pair of chopsticks, and think that's sadness. But they don't know. That silence isn't an emptiness to be filled. It's the final refuge of a soul once drained by relationships that didn't know how to care. Back then, he tried to belong. He softened his voice to keep the peace. He swallowed his pain to hold on to a bond that was breaking. He waited for an apology that never came. He sacrificed himself for relationships that seemed worth keeping, until one day he woke up and realized a truth both simple and bitter. Peace doesn't come from having someone beside you. It comes from being yourself, without judgment, without explanation, without endurance. And from that day on, he began living a different life. A small life, but a deep one. No more endless plans. No more chasing connection just to avoid being called lonely. Only mornings with hot coffee, where he sits watching sunlight spill through the window, undisturbed. Afternoons with old books, where the characters understand him better than anyone ever did in real life. Evenings with the wind outside the porch, and a warm light just enough not to feel empty. He no longer fears weekends alone. He doesn't need anyone to say goodnight in order to sleep peacefully. No one waits, and there's no need to rush. And the strange thing, Eisenly, when he no longer needed to prove his worth to anyone, did he truly feel worthy? This video isn't about sadness. It's about a journey of return. About people once swallowed by noise, by expectations, by the exhausting effort to not be left behind. And then, after it all, they discovered something most people never reach: the power of stillness. If you've ever chosen to step back not because you're afraid of love, but because you're no longer willing to trade away your peace, then this is your story. And from that journey, we'll go deeper to explore 9 quiet strengths of those who've learned to live alone. Not because they don't need anyone, but because they no longer want to lose themselves trying to keep someone else. Not everyone who lives alone truly understands themselves. But those who stay with themselves long and naturally stay, without escaping into work, entertainment, or shallow relationships, have something different. They begin to see themselves more clearly, not during moments of success or happiness, but in the quiet mornings when no one checks in the evenings with no phone ringing, in the long, silent winters when no one comes by. They've spent years, sometimes an entire decade, observing themselves like watching a stranger, to understand what makes them sad, what wounds them, what makes them feel truly alive. They no longer react instinctively. They pause. They observe their emotions like waves coming, then going. No rushing to deny. No forcing themselves to be okay. Israel. And in that patient observation, they learn to move through life with a calmness that the young often mistake for indifference. I once met Ruth, a retired sculptor. Her home sat at the end of a quiet alley, with pieces of her art placed everywhere as if they didn't need to be admired to hold their worth. She told me, holding a lump of wet clay in her hands, when you sit with yourself long enough, the noise begins to fall away, and the truth starts to emerge. Insa. She didn't live to be recognized. She didn't need praise to feel worthy. Every step she took, every way she looked, radiated a quiet that had been forged through heartbreak. Self-awareness at this age is no longer a philosophy. It's a way of life. It's how they return inward before reacting. It's how they choose calm not because they're weak, but because they clearly know what's worth their energy and what's not. No need to raise their voice. They walk through the world slowly, steadily, unaffected by stares or judgments. No urgency to prove anything to anyone. And that understanding quiet, unwavering is the first strength of those who've learned to live alone without being swept away. They don't need anyone to validate who they are, because they've already found that answer in the moments when no one else stayed to listen. There is a kind of strength that doesn't need to be proven through muscles, a loud voice, or a long list of connections. It's quiet, independent, boastful, not needing recognition, yet clearly present in the smallest details of everyday life. Older individuals who've lived alone for many years don't just know how to care for themselves physically. They also know how to stand up emotionally every time life pushes them into a dark corner. They change the light bulb when it goes out. They check the map when they're headed somewhere unfamiliar. They prepare their own breakfast and eat in silence and needing no small talk to fill the space. They book a train ticket for one, choose the table by the window, and go as if they're not missing anything at all. But perhaps what I admire most is how they face pain without needing an embrace. They've said goodbye to a life partner, a loved one, a dream that never came true. No one helped them up, and they didn't wait. They simply stood on their own quietly and steadily. I remember Mr. Wilson, 72, who lives at the end of the street. still changes his own tires, still carries a pocketbook and a small backpack every time he travels. He once told me, independence isn't about having no one beside you. It's about trusting that, if no one is there, you can still keep going without betraying yourself. That line stayed with me for a long time, because in truth, independence isn't hard-edged strength. It's preparation. Preparation to not collapse if someone walks away. Preparation to not lose your way if all your plans fall apart. Preparation to soothe yourself when no one knows what you need. And from that preparation, they live more lightly. Not dependent, not needing anyone to validate their happiness, not needing permission to feel joy. They choose solitude not because they've lost faith in others, but because they've learned to trust themselves, and that is the hardest thing a grown person can ever learn to do. Silent spaces are often mistaken as voids that need to be filled. But for older people who have learned to live with quiet, those spaces are fertile ground where creativity takes root and blooms. They don't need the spotlight. They don't wait for shares or likes. Because what they create isn't meant to go outward. It moves inward. They paint to heal. They write to hear their own voice more clearly. They grow a garden not for admiration, but to have a place to breathe. In a world already too suffocating, to them, creativity isn't a skill. It's a rhythm of breath, a place where they can be themselves honestly and deeply. I once met Margaret, 79, who lives in a small house on the edge of town. Her old garage had been transformed into a patchwork quilt studio. Each piece of fabric on the wall held a story. Some stitches curved like the bright laughter of youth. Others bore muted tones, like a freezing winter she once endured alone. She looked at me, needle and thread in hand, and said softly, "Art is how I talk to myself. It's okay if no one listens, but I need to speak." There was no performance in that space, only pure honesty. Each item she created was more than an object. It was a part of her soul drawn out, seen, and accepted. Others might need a studio. She only needed a quiet corner. Others might seek inspiration. She only needed time. And in that quiet, inspiration wasn't distracted nor stolen. It was distilled pure, silent, and full of life. People often think solitude extinguishes creativity. But for those who know how to sit with themselves, that's exactly when the flame burns brightest. They don't speak much, but when they do, the whole room seems to slow down. Not because of a loud voice, not because of grand, dramatic words, but because every word they speak is considered. Every thought they share has been distilled through years of reflection, through long nights when no one listened but themselves. People who have lived alone for many years often carry a rich inner world, not the kind that's painted to impress, but one shaped by time, by experience, by quiet pains no one else ever knew. They don't jump into conversations just to fill the silence. They don't try to be interesting, but if you're patient enough to stay, to truly listen, you'll find they hold a kind of treasure, quiet, unpolished, but immeasurably deep. I remember Mr. Harold, an elderly neighbor who lived a few houses down. His living room looked like a small library, with dark wooden shelves covering every wall. Every book he'd ever read was annotated by hand-thin, slanted lines of ink filled with contemplation. When he spoke about Moby Dick, he didn't analyze it like a professor. He talked about it as if he had sat beside the protagonist, as if he had drifted across the sea with the white whale, surviving some storm together both outside and inside the mind. He wasn't good at small talk, but every time he spoke, I felt as though I was seeing the world through a rare lens, where everything moved slower, deeper, and with greater meaning. They see what others overlook. They notice patterns in behavior, emotional cycles, lessons from history and literature, not to show off knowledge, but because they've pondered them long enough for those ideas to become part of their soul's structure. That inner world isn't something they share lightly. It's where they live, where, after each disappointment from the outside world, they return to rearrange everything with quiet thoughtfulness. And from that place they offer the world things that few still possess: depth, presence, and a vision that sees beyond the surface. There is no stage for the times they fell, no applause when they quietly stood back up. Older individuals who choose to live alone often do so not because they want to isolate themselves, but because they've known loss deep enough to understand that some pain no one else can carry for you. And so, they learn to walk through it alone. They once said goodbye to a life partner after decades of walking side by side. They once parted ways with an old friend whose name no longer belonged in daily life. They once folded away a dream once so vivid, so beautiful that could never take shape. They once looked into a mirror and were startled to realize that youth had slipped away without warning. But instead of breaking down, they chose to rebuild. Quietly, patiently, without needing recognition. They don't blame life. They don't offload their pain onto others. They slow their breath. They write a few lines into an old notebook, its pages yellowed by time. They walk down familiar streets, as quietly as the mood they carry. They cry, but no one sees. And then one day, when the sky isn't as heavy as it was yesterday, they begin again, from scratch. No fanfare, no celebration. Their strength isn't in never falling. It's in how they fall then rise then continue on, as if they were never shattered. And in that continuation, there's a beauty all its own. No one sees the moment they stitch themselves back together, but you can feel it. In the way they gently smile at strangers, in the way they don't lash out, even though their hearts have once been torn apart, in the way they live, fully, without needing pity. They don't need to be seen as strong, because they know true strength doesn't need a name. It lives in those quiet moments of rising, when no one ever knew just how deep the fall had been. If you ask them, what makes you happy each day, you won't hear grand things. Not a new car, not a distant trip, not anything flashy. You'll hear answers so small that others might not even notice. The sound of wind rustling through the trees in the early morning, the first sip of tea when the air is still cool, the smell of earth after a light rain. Older people who've lived alone for years don't search for joy in faraway places. They don't need much to feel that life is full, because after all the losses, after all the days when no one called their name, they've learned to recognize beauty in the very moment that is present. Not because they didn't have choices, but because they chose to narrow their focus, to see more deeply, instead of more broadly. They don't seek noise to cover up loneliness. They seek presence, and that is something few dare to truly pursue. A morning where soft golden light filters through the window, an old tune from a radio in the kitchen corner, a simple meal, cooked slowly. For them, that's enough. There's no need to wait for something grander, because they've come to understand the smallest things, if looked at long enough, become reasons to live each day with gratitude. There is a kind of compassion that can't be learned from books, doesn't come from lectures, and isn't born of empty advice. It is cultivated in silence, in the years when a person has had to face pain alone, with no one to call, no shoulder to lean on, no one to offer comfort. Living alone over time hasn't made them cold. On the contrary, it's made them softer, deeper, and more sensitive to the pain of others. They've heard many sounds in their life: the slam of a door that never opened again, the ticking of a clock through sleepless nights, the long silence of an unanswered message. And through it all, they've learned how to listen, not just with their ears, but with the full presence of a soul that knows what it's like to wait and have no one come. That's why, when someone turns to them, they don't rush to speak. They don't rush to fix. They simply stay, gently, without interrupting, without imposing, and that presence, quiet but steady, is more healing than any words could be. I remember Helen, 84, a widow who volunteers every Thursday at a nursing home. She doesn't preach. She doesn't try to make death less painful. She just sits beside someone fading away, holds their hand, and says softly, "We don't need to fix death to make it bearable. We just need to learn to honor the leaving." That is the kind of compassion that can only grow in someone who has become familiar with silence. It is not loud, nor dazzling, but deep, and warm enough that others want to draw near when life becomes too heavy. Because they know too well what it feels like to have no one beside them, they will never let someone else face their own storm alone. They don't need to say, "I understand," because their quiet presence is understanding itself. There's a skill that only those who've grown tired enough truly master, saying no without guilt. Older people who've lived alone long enough no longer chase social gatherings to appear agreeable. They no longer hold on to relationships just to avoid being labeled difficult or odd, because they've learned this: truth protecting your own energy is sacred, not something to apologize for. They don't disappear without warning like younger people who ghost. They also don't stir tension or arguments to justify a refusal. They simply say, "I won't be attending that day," or "I need some quiet time for myself." No long explanations, no guilt, no need for further clarification. I once witnessed Sylvia, 81, being invited to a family gathering everyone called very important. She simply smiled, poured more tea into her cup, and gently replied, "Right now, I need a quiet weekend. The family will understand." And they truly did, because she never avoided people, but she also never allowed anyone to cross the boundaries she had drawn. Not to isolate herself, but to protect the peace she had spent a lifetime building. Their boundaries aren't walls built out of fear. They're soft, but steady fences, constructed from all the times they were exhausted from trying to please everyone. They know this well. If you don't protect yourself, no one else will. And because of that, whenever they choose to be with someone, it's because they genuinely want to, not out of pressure, not out of obligation. Their presence is always a sincere gift, never a duty. Because when you've learned how to hold space for yourself, you also learn how to love others without sacrificing your own wholeness. The paradox is this: those who spend the most time alone are often the ones who know how to love the deepest when they truly choose to connect. They don't need a large group of friends. They don't need lively parties. Just one or two genuine people, willing to sit quietly beside them without needing to say a word that's enough. And when they are with someone, they are not distracted. They don't multitask during conversation. They don't talk just to be polite. They are fully present, gracious, and thoughtful. Because to them, relationships are not meant to fill a void. They are meant to add color to a life that already has depth. I once witnessed Mr. Louis, who had lived alone for over 20 years, stay in touch with only 3 old friends. Each year, they would take a road trip across the state. No social media, no photos posted, no check-ins. Just old friends, sitting in a car together, listening to cassette tapes and retelling stories they all knew by heart. No fancy words, just truth. And these kinds of relationships, rare, quiet, and sincere, are what make their lives richer, not more complicated. There is a kind of strength that doesn't require lifting weights, delivering speeches, or being replayed on television. It's the strength of someone who chooses to walk through life with themselves and feels that nothing is missing. Older people who live alone are not broken souls. They are individuals who have found balance within themselves. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be saved. They have built a life where peace exists in every pause, where silence is not an escape, but a true home. And if you ever meet someone like that, don't just feel pity. Respect them, because they are living proof that a person can live kindly, deeply, and fully, without needing anyone to validate their worth. And if you are such a person, be proud. Look back at the road you've traveled, at the sleepless nights you survived, at the misunderstandings you endured, without letting go of your kindness. You carry a calm the world is losing. You hold a compassion forged through loss. You are a reminder that strength doesn't need to shout to be seen. Sometimes, just being presentfully, quietly, is enough to stir another heart. And if you're still living this way, keep going. The world needs people like you, not to make it louder, but to help it remember how to live slowly, live truthfully, and live with depth.